Hello, everybody. I am Bincheng Mao, founder of Inclusion Advocate, and I'm so honored to be here today to speak with General McMaster about honoring veterans, youth engagement in public service, and restoring public trust in institutions. General McMaster, welcome to our program.
Bincheng, great to be with you, and thanks for what you're doing with this great program.
Thank you so much. Let's begin with honoring veterans. On last year's Veterans Day, you wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal calling on people to understand military service and understand the lives of veterans. General McMaster, what do you hope civilians to understand about veterans' process of rejoining civilian life? And what do you hope the rest of society can do to help veterans through this challenging and unique process?
I think understanding the rewards of service, as I wrote in that essay, is really important to understanding the veterans' experience, right, and helping them rejoin their communities as they come back from military service. And I think a lot of times popular culture and the popular impressions of military service sort of cheapen and coarsen the experience a bit, because they tend to look at veterans mainly as maybe traumatized, fragile human beings who had to endure hardships, when in fact, veterans are able to take advantage of these less tangible rewards of service, being part of something bigger than yourself, and especially being part of a team that's bound together by higher purpose, common purpose, mutual trust and respect and affection. And then I think that's what veterans miss the most, is being part of that community, right? In which really the man or woman next to them is willing to give everything, including their own lives for them. And so I think when veterans do become sort of disconnected and feel as if the transition is difficult, it's because they're no longer part of that tight knit group, and that's why it's important for them to become integral parts of their community.
Let's discuss restoring trust in public institutions. General McMaster, a recent Gallup survey showed that the military is the most respected institution in this country today. But if we go back in time to the moment when you first entered West Point in 1980, it was about 5 years after the end of the Vietnam War. The military's relations with civil society and the public's trust in the military was not at the highest level. What do you think enabled the military to restore its relations and restore trust with civil society in the next 40 years? And do you think any of those lessons might be applicable to other government institutions today?
I think what happened was a renaissance in the Army in the 1980s, really directed by an officer corps who had served in the Army prior to Vietnam, had seen the strains that were placed on the Army in an unpopular war, but a war in which actually the personnel policies seemed to be deliberately designed to break the armed forces and the Army in particular, with the easy draft exclusions and then also the way conscription was conducted, the ease of getting deferrals among those who could just opt out, and then of course the Army at the time was a conscript force that reflected kind of the maladies in our society as well, right? Racial and social divisions and issues such as drug abuse and so forth. So really the discipline in the Army suffered, the professionalism of the Army suffered, and then add on to that the trauma of a lost war, right? And so it was the Army hit its nadir, I think, there in the 1970s, and began a new era with an all volunteer force and officers who were determined to change, really make big changes in how the Army recruited, really focusing on excellence and standards for just even being able to come into the Army, but then also reinstilling discipline, invigorating training and education in a really profound and positive way, changing our doctrine and how we fought. And of course, there were reasons for urgency there, because remember, we're still at the height of the Cold War, right? And there was a sense that the lost war in Vietnam would embolden our adversaries, in particular the Soviet Union. So it was really this need to transform the Army and the impetus to do it, and leaders who had a very strong vision for the future and implemented that vision. I don't think we should take for granted, the trust in military institutions. And I think that really what's dangerous today more than anything else is unfamiliarity with service in our military. Under 1% serve, and so we don't have a good idea, of what military service is. And I think in particular, a lot of Americans don't understand the warrior ethos, right? The sacred covenant that binds servicemen and women to each other and to the society in whose name they fight and serve. And that ethos is based on principles, right? Principles like honor, courage, maybe especially self-sacrifice, right? The willingness to give of oneself for your mission and for your fellow servicemen and women. And I think that also Americans don't understand how American warriors, because of their discipline and professionalism, are really strong in terms of combat prowess, the ability to overmatch the enemy in combat, but also they are humane. They help make war less inhumane by applying firepower and fighting with discipline, and discrimination and proportionality and so forth, consistent with with just war theory. And so I think what Americans don't understand is that their warriors are both warriors and humanitarians, in part because we've been engaged against the enemies of all civilized peoples, but also because of that ethos that is important to maintain.
General McMaster, in your most recent book, Battlegrounds: The Fight to Defend the Free World, you dedicated an entire chapter on North Korea. In recent years, there has been this discussion on sanctions on North Korea and how to bring about denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. Former President Jimmy Carter recently said that he's against some of the sanctions on North Korea because they might hurt the people who are already suffering under a dictatorship. What's your view on the sanctions on North Korea, and how should we factor human rights into the decision-making process about sanctions on North Korea?
I think what we have to recognize is the reason that North Korean people are suffering is because of the Kim family regime, right? The only hereditary communist dictatorship in the world, right? Which prioritizes, its own, maintaining its own grip on power over everything else, right? So while the people of North Korea experience deprivation, it hasn't slowed down the building of monuments to the Kim family. It hasn't slowed down the building of from North Korean standards, luxury apartments for the ruling class in Pyongyang. And it hasn't slowed down the procurement of weapons of all kinds, including a nuclear weapons program in an effort to create, to develop the most dangerous weapons on earth, right, in its arsenal. So I think that we have to recognize that the source of deprivation in the North is the Kim family regime. Now, of course, the Kim family regime wants to blame everybody else for that, and has made deprivation into some sort of a virtue under the Juche ideology, right, of self-reliance and so forth. But I think that what's important is this, keeping the sanctions in place, right? Because I think the only hope of ensuring that the Kim family regime doesn't get the most destructive weapons on earth is to convince the regime that it is safer without the weapons than it is with them. And it would make sense, I think, not to repeat the failed pattern of previous efforts, which is North Korean extortion with like the missile test you've just seen, with the Yongbyon reactor kicking back in and so forth. And then us and others making concessions just for the privilege of talking to the North, sanctions relief and so forth, payoffs oftentimes in cash. And then what starts then is a long, drawn out, frustrating negotiation process, which over time, after concession that we make, results in a weak agreement and a big payoff to the North. Extortion works. And then that agreement locks in the status quo as the new normal, so the world is not any safer. And then North Korea just breaks the agreement again to repeat the cycle. How about not doing that, I think? And so I would argue for an intensification of sanctions, and potentially even sanctions on those that bypass the UN Security Council authorized sanctions. For example, secondary sanctions on Chinese banks that are involved in continuing the support for the regime. I don't know if you saw the big celebrations that just happened in Pyongyang, right? With with the fighter jets, with the multicolored smoke. Well, it takes fuel to put on that demonstration, and it takes fuel to fuel rockets. And 98% of that fuel comes across the Chinese-North Korean border as imports.
Last but certainly not least, let's discuss leadership in public service. General McMaster, you've led the National Security Council, commanded troops in Iraq and Kuwait, and also worked with other great leaders throughout your public service career. What is it that you think makes a person a great leader?
I think understanding what your role is as a leader, right? Which is not about you. It's about those who are serving in your organization, those who you serve alongside, and it's about your mission. And I think if leaders are motivated well, right? If their base motivation is to serve, that's the first and most important, I think, aspect of effective leadership. And then once, once you're in a position of leadership, to really establish a common vision for your organization, a common vision that everybody buys into and understands really what you're trying to achieve together. And then from that point on, a lot of what you do is listen, listening to those who are committed to that mission alongside of you. Because really, when you can, the way to unleash excellence in an organization is to have everybody taking initiative to make the organization better and more effective.
Thank you so much, General McMaster, for your insights and for being on our program today. I'd like to close by wishing all our viewers good health during this challenging time. Thank you and take care.